All right, so get this. We're diving into a language that's practically a time capsule today. Icelandic. You know me, I get super stoked about this stuff, and the facts you've dug up are incredible.
It really is something else. It's remarkable how much this language can reveal about history, about culture, even about how we use language, how our brains process it.
Okay, so before we even get into the cool stuff, paint us a picture. Where does Icelandic fit in with all the other languages in the world?
Well, imagine a huge family tree of languages. Right and way out on a limb is this distant cousin who somehow hasn't aged a day since the Viking era. That's Icelandic. It's Indo-European, of course, but specifically North Germanic, West Scandinavian, to be exact.
So we're talking those Viking raiders, but with a twist.
Exactly. You'll find close ties to Faroes, even some Norwegian dialects. And here's the real shocker, you wouldn't understand modern Icelandic if you only spoke Swedish or Danish.
Wait, really?
It's incredibly conservative, meaning it's changed so little over time.
How little are we talking here?
Get this. Speakers can still understand texts from 800 years ago.
Whoa.
It's like us picking up Shakespeare and understanding it perfectly.
Okay, now that's what I'm talking about. This is a serious deep dive. We've got Viking sagas, a language frozen in time. This is incredible. So how did Icelandic get to be this way?
Picture this. Around 900 AD, Viking settlers arrive in Iceland, right? Bringing their language Old Norse. But here's the thing. These weren't all straight from Scandinavia. Many had settled around the Irish Sea, intermarrying with women from places like Norse Ireland.
Hold on. So we're mixing Vikings. Now you're telling me there's Gaelic in there too.
Yeah.
The beautiful Irish language.
You got it. The languages are constantly changing, borrowing, blending. It's how you get Old Icelandic, which eventually leads to the modern version we know today. Yeah. And the coolest part, while spoken Icelandic naturally changed over time, the written form has been surprisingly stable since the 11th century.
The 11th century. They were writing down Icelandic way back then. Were they using chisels and stone tablets?
Not quite. They used vellum, a type of prepared animal skin, to create these beautiful manuscripts. And these texts were incredibly important. They were the record of their history, filled with epic poems, stories of heroes and gods, and of course, those famous sagas passed down from generation to generation.
Okay, you're really painting a picture here. So these early Icelandic writings, they were mostly sagas, poems, that kind of thing.
Exactly. That's what we call Old Icelandic, a Western dialect of Old Norse. But here's a fascinating tidbit. While the written form remained pretty consistent, the pronunciation, particularly of vowels, underwent some pretty major shifts between the 12th and 16th centuries.
So if we could hop in a time machine and hear those sagas read aloud, they might sound different from how we imagine them today.
Precisely. Language is always dynamic, even when it seems frozen in time. And this evolution continued. In the 19th century, a Danish linguist named Rasmus Rask enters the scene.
Okay.
He was like a linguistic Viking explorer mapping the intricacies of the Icelandic language instead of new lands.
And what did this linguistic Viking discover on his adventures?
Well, he came across this remarkable document from the 12th century known as the First Grammatical Treatise.
Wow.
Imagine finding a nearly 800-year-old grammar guide.
That's wild.
He used this ancient text as inspiration to standardize the language, and thanks in part to his work written Icelandic today, is remarkably similar to what people were reading centuries ago.
That just blows my mind. To think you could pick up a book written 800 years ago and actually get the gist of it, that's incredible. That's the beauty of Icelandic. But speaking of things that make Icelandic unique, can we talk about those letters? You know, the ones, those ancient-looking letters?
You mean Thorn and Eth. Those are some of my favorites.
Mine too. They're like secret ancient symbols hidden in plain sight.
And they're not just for looks. They represent specific sounds just like they did in Old English. It's remarkable how Icelandic has preserved these little pieces of linguistic history. It's like guarding a treasure trove of sounds.
Okay, before we get too lost in the mists of time, let's bring this back to the 21st century. What's the situation with Icelandic today? Is it officially recognized or is it more of a historical language?
It's far from a relic. In 2011, the Icelandic parliament declared Icelandic as the official language of the Icelandic people. What's more, they mandated that public authorities ensure its use in all facets of Icelandic society.
So they're serious about protecting their language. But what about their interactions with other Nordic countries? Iceland is part of that whole Nordic group, right? Do they just default to English or is there some understanding there?
It's fascinating, actually. While Iceland is a proud member of the Nordic Council, which primarily uses Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, they haven't forgotten about their own unique tongue.
Oh.
The council publishes in Icelandic, recognizing its cultural weight.
That's great. But what about regular folks just talking? Like, let's say an Icelander is in Denmark. Can they just walk into a government office and expect to be understood?
You're talking about the Nordic Language Convention, which has been around since 1987. It gives Icelandic citizens the right to use their language when dealing with official bodies in other Nordic countries without needing interpreters or translators.
Interesting.
This covers essential services like healthcare job centers, even the police, basic things everyone might need at some point.
That's a win for language diversity. But let's be real. How well does this convention actually work in practice? Are other Nordic countries truly equipped to handle Icelandic? Or is this more of a nice idea that doesn't always pan out?
You've hit on a common issue with international agreements, the gap between good intentions and reality. While the convention exists, its effectiveness often comes down to whether the specific office has staff who speak Icelandic.
That makes sense. You can have all the rules in the world, but it's useless if no one understands you. So what happens if they can't find someone? Do Icelanders just switch to English?
While many Icelanders do speak English, there's actually some evidence suggesting that their overall English proficiency might be a bit overestimated. So while some manage, it's not always a given.
That's fascinating. It really highlights the importance of linguistic diversity, even in a place like Scandinavia, which is often seen as very homogenous.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about Icelandic's place in the world, its history, those cool letters. But what about how it sounds?
Now we're getting to the really unique stuff, the nuts and bolts of what makes Icelandic sound like no other language on Earth. Ready to take a peek inside your own mouth, because that's where the magic happens with Icelandic sounds. It's all about how you shape the air, those little explosions of breath that make all the difference.
Okay, you've got my attention. Let's talk about Icelandic sounds. What sets them apart?
Let's start with consonants. The building blocks of any good word. Icelandic takes aspiration seriously, that puff of air we add to some sounds.
Right.
Like the P in pin versus spin. That P in pin has a little burst of air, that's aspiration.
Okay, I vaguely remember that from school.
Okay.
So Icelandic is all about aspirated PS.
Oh, it's way more interesting than that. They aspirate P, T, and K and get this. The position of that puff of air actually changes depending on where it is in a word. At the beginning of a word, it's post-aspirated. The air comes after the consonant. But in the middle, it flips to pre-aspiration.
No way.
It's like their consonants have their own internal rhythm section.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. So you're telling me every Icelandic speaker is like a master of breath control. I could barely manage to blow out all the candles on a cake.
It's something you pick up naturally with the language, but it just goes to show how much information is packed into even the simplest Icelandic word.
Wow.
And then there's this thing called prepausal devoicing.
Okay, that one sounds a little intimidating. Break it down for me.
Think about the word dog in English. Now, at the very end of that word, just as you're about to pause, imagine that G sound kind of softens, almost disappears.
Okay.
That's what happens in Icelandic with certain voiced consonants when they come at the end of a word. They become voiceless when you pause after them. It's like the sound takes a little breather before the next word.
So it's all about the sounds working together like a linguistic puzzle. Right, we've tackled consonants. Those are complex enough. Tell me vowels are a little more straightforward.
Icelandic vowels are truly something else. They're like a beautifully tuned instrument. They have what we call monophthongs. Pure vowel sounds, no blends. But here's the thing, each one can be long or short, and that tiny difference can completely change the meaning of a word.
Wait, so one vowel, two different sounds, two different meanings. It's like double the vocabulary packed into each vowel. My brain is already doing backflips trying to keep up.
And we're not even done yet. They also have diphthongs. Those are vowel pairs that blend together.
Right.
Like the ow sound in cow, that's a diphthong. And just like the single vowels, these diphthongs can be long or short as well. It adds this incredible depth and richness to the spoken language.
Okay, I have to admit, even with those examples, my brain is still a little fuzzy on the whole vowel situation. But it sounds beautiful. It's no wonder their sagas and poems are so captivating. But vowels and consonants are just the beginning, right? What really brings a language to life is the grammar, the structure. And from what I've heard, Icelandic grammar is not for the easily intimidated.
You're not wrong. It's got a reputation for a reason. But here's how I like to think about it. Icelandic is what we call a synthetic language.
Okay.
It packs tons of grammatical information into its words, especially the verbs. Remember those cases we talked about earlier?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory. Why are cases so important?
Imagine you have all these words right, and the cases are like outfits you can put on them. Each outfit tells you something about that word's role in the sentence, who's doing the action, who's receiving it, that kind of thing. In Icelandic, nouns change their form depending on their case. And get this, they also change based on whether it's singular or plural, and even their gender.
Hold on, gender. Like even objects have a gender in Icelandic, like a table is a he or a she.
Precisely. Icelandic has 3 genders: masculine, feminine, and neuter.
Wow.
But it gets even more interesting. They have these things called declensions, which are like families of nouns that share similar endings.
Okay.
Think of them like clans. Each clan has its own way of changing its outfit depending on the grammatical situation.
Okay, my brain is officially starting to hurt. Declensions, cases, genders.
Yeah.
It's a lot to keep track of. But I guess that's what makes Icelandic so unique, right? It's a language that follows its own ancient set of rules. But something tells me verbs are where things get really fun.
You got it. Icelandic verbs are like the multitasking superheroes of grammar. They change depending on the tense, mood, person, number, you name it, even voice.
Okay, whoa, let's break this down. We've got tense, mood, person, number. Those are familiar. But remind me again, what is voice?
Voice tells us who's doing what to whom. Is the subject doing the action, or are they on the receiving end?
Got it.
Active voice, passive voice, or somewhere in between, that's middle voice.
So Icelandic verbs are juggling all of those grammatical elements at the same time. That's some impressive linguistic acrobatics. What else makes these verbs so special? You mentioned something earlier about a quirky subject. That sounds intriguing.
Ah, yes. So in most languages, the subject of a sentence usually takes the nominative case right. But Icelandic likes to keep things interesting. Sometimes the verb decides, nope, you're not going to be in the nominative today subject. You're going to be in the dative case because I said so.
It's like the verbs are running the show, laying down the grammatical law. I guess even in grammar, there's room for a little rebellious streak, so this quirky subject thing. It's just one example of how Icelandic verbs keep things lively, the 10 tenses, although they often use helping verbs to form them, just like in English. And then there are those strong verbs, the rebels of the verb world, clinging on to their irregular forms. Wow, so much to learn. It's like trying to crack a code, but a code that unlocks centuries of history and culture. So we've explored those incredible sounds, we've navigated the world of verbs. But what about the words themselves? What can you tell us about the actual vocabulary of this fascinating language? So we've got these ancient Vikings settling down in Iceland, writing down their epic sagas. But then Christianity comes along. I imagine that probably shook things up in the vocabulary department, right?
Oh, absolutely. They needed a whole new set of words for all these religious concepts. Think about it. Churches, saints, the idea of sin. These were concepts that just didn't exist in their Old Norse vocabulary.
So where do you even begin? Did they just invent a whole new category of holy words, or did they borrow from other languages?
It was a bit of both, actually, which makes sense. For the really important religious terms, they looked to their linguistic cousins borrowing from other Scandinavian languages.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like the Icelandic word for church is kirkja, which has roots in those other Nordic tongues.
So even when they adopted new words, they still wanted something that felt familiar, something that resonated with their existing language.
Right.
But it wasn't just religion that brought in new vocabulary, right? What about trade, politics, all the other stuff that comes with a growing society?
Well, exactly. As Iceland's interactions with the wider world expanded, so did their vocabulary. They picked up words related to courtly life and knightship from the French, probably through cultural exchange, maybe even some medieval diplomacy. And get this, many of their terms for trade and commerce came from Low German.
Low German. Now that's a curveball. I love how these little linguistic breadcrumbs reveal these fascinating connections across different cultures and time periods. But here's what I'm curious about. How did Icelanders handle this influx of foreign words? Did they just embrace it? Or was there a sense of wanting to protect the integrity of their own language?
That's where we get to one of the most fascinating things about Icelandic, this idea of linguistic purism.
All right.
It's like they became guardians of their own language, carefully choosing which words were worthy of being included.
So they're like the gatekeepers of their own linguistic treasure. I'm dying to hear some examples. What are some of these homegrown Icelandic words?
Imagine it's the dawn of the telephone era, right? Instead of simply adopting the English word, Icelanders created the word sími. And get this, sími comes from an old word meaning thread or wire.
Wow.
They took this new technology and wove it into their existing language, drawing a connection between telephone wires carrying voices and those traditional threads that have always been part of their culture.
Sími. That's brilliant. It's such an elegant way of describing something new, using the building blocks of their own language. But it makes you wonder, how do they decide which words to keep which ones to adapt and which ones to invent from scratch? Who are these linguistic judges?
You're talking about the Icelandic Language Council,
Okay.
a group of language experts, educators, people from all walks of life who are passionate about their language.
Right.
They're like the caretakers of Icelandic, figuring out how to incorporate new terms, especially for things like science and technology, without losing the essence of what makes Icelandic unique.
So they're on this never-ending quest to find the perfect Icelandic words for artificial intelligence, quantum physics, the frontiers of science. That is one cool job. But let's be real for a second. Is all this linguistic purism just for official stuff like government documents and textbooks? Do regular Icelanders actually speak this way, or do a few English words sneak in there?
It's a balancing act for sure. Language is a living, breathing thing. It's constantly evolving. So yeah, in everyday conversations, you'll hear a mix of Icelandic and borrowed words, especially English, because let's face it, English is everywhere. But in more formal settings like books, newspapers, official speeches, that commitment to Icelandic really shines through.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between honoring their linguistic heritage and adapting to a globalized world. Which leads to another question. How does this dedication to linguistic purism, to consciously shaping the evolution of their language, how does that impact Icelandic culture and identity as a whole?
That's a question worth pondering. It reminds us that language isn't just about communication, it's about how we perceive the world, how we connect with one another, how we understand our place in history.
It's like each language is a unique lens offering a different perspective on the human experience.
Yeah.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we've come to the end of our Icelandic adventure. We've journeyed through its Viking roots, explored its mind-boggling grammar, and uncovered the secrets of its linguistic purism.
We've witnessed how a language can be a time capsule, a testament to the enduring power of words to connect us to the past, the present, and the future.
It's been an incredible journey, but before we go, we want to leave you with something to think about. We've seen how resilient Icelandic is, how it's thrived for centuries, despite all the outside influences. But in a world where English dominates, where efficiency and ease often overshadow diversity can retreat them, a language as unique and, let's be honest, as grammatically challenging as Icelandic truly thrives beyond the borders of Iceland. That's something to ponder as we head into the future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.